Welcome to A Witch in Ivalice, a Final Fantasy XII podcast. I am E.T., an FF12 fan and prequel novels writer. And today's topic is the Rozarrian Empire. Now I like to start such talks with what we already know about the topic. And when we're talking about Rozarria, we know two things. One, the political regime, namely an empire like Arcadia. And two, one character in the whole game, and that is Al-Cid. Now I will come back to these two elements later, but first let's start with a little geography. As you might know, the world of Ivalice, in which FF12 takes place, is made of 3 continents. We have Valendia on the east. That's your right-hand side when you look at a map, if you're bad with cardinal directions. There is the continent of Ardelia on the west, meaning your left-hand side. And finally, there is the southern continent, Karawan, which I call the continent of wilderness, with most of the yoked regions, with thick mist leading to nasty monsters around the areas, such as Golmar Jungle, Dahara Village, or Giravegan. Now let's be back to our 2 civilized continents, Ardelia and Valendia. Ardelia is the continent where the Rozarrian Empire and the Kingdom of Dalmasca are located. While the continent of Valendia is home to the Empire of Arcadia and the Kingdom of Nabradia, Nabradia being home to Prince Wrestler in the game's introduction. Now it is interesting to notice something. Ardelia has Rozarria and Dalmasca, right? However, we never see Rozarria threatening Dalmasca directly. Maybe they don't like Vaughn as a protagonist or something. However, Valendia, which has Arcadia and Nabradia, has very thorough interests from the Arcadian Empire to the kingdom that is Nabradia. And that could mean that Nabradia has more resources than Dalmasca, is more interesting to have in one's empire. We don't really know the answer. However, as we might remember, the introduction of FF12 precisely is about the Nabradian invasion, involving both Arcadia and Rozarria. Now, even though Rozarria is never seen threatening the kingdom of Dalmasca, I think it is safe to assume that as the map of Ivalice is shown to us throughout the game, the 2 empires follow a logic of living space across their respective continents. Living space leading us back to a real-life empire that was kind of a big topic in Europe in the 20th century. Because Rozarria spans most of Ardelia and Arcadia spans most of Valendia, which could mean that both empires, which didn't start as empires to begin with, conquered the lands nearby until they almost conquered the whole continent. And if there is a piece of land that still doesn't belong to them in their respective continent, then they will do anything to invade it. And this is what we see in the beginning of the game, with Arcadia against Nabradia. So maybe the goal of Rozarria would have been to conquer Dalmasca at some point. And the game would have been very different, right? Now let's talk about Rozarria more specifically with their ruling family. The ruling family of Rozarria is House Margrace. We know that House Margrace existed during the Galtian Alliance. The Galtian Alliance being the so-called period of peace and prosperity that the Dynast King Wraithfall started. Then, House Margrace was a clan among the different clans of the Ardelian continent, and gathered around them other clans of Ardelia to form what is now known as the Rozarrian Empire. We know that House Margrace is located in a state. Their state is called Ambervale, which Al-Cid mentions during the game. We do not know from the game or canon books of any of the other states or clans of Rozarria. So House Margrace managed to gather the other ones around them, and they ruled the then new Empire of Rozarria. However, that only lasted 1 century. Afterwards, Rozarria faced a military defeat. Against who? Arcadia, of course. So, generals from the military decided that Rozarria should not be ruled anymore by the people of House Margrace. They decided to rule the Rozarrian Empire themselves, and Rozarria became a military state. And that lasted 1.5 century. House Margrace came back to power only 50 years before the game. So, just like many countries, we can say that Rozarria's leading hands changed a lot across the ages before the game starts. And that leads us to our next topic: how to define Rozarria. It is not easy given the very few elements we have in the game. However, one thing is certain, is that we can find an approximation to a definition by comparing it with Arcadia. I think it is pretty clear that Arcadia considers itself as the empire of law, be it with the importance of judges, of the Senate, and of the Arcadian seal itself, which looks like a balance or scales. However, Rozarria, while we don't know for sure all these elements concerning it, has a history of dealing with the military. So we can say that Arcadia is the empire of law, while Rozarria is the empire of might. Because for much time in its history, Rozarria was only ruled by generals. And that is still a topic during the game, as we hear Al-Cid complaining about. Arcadia, however, was never fully a military state. The military is entirely controlled by the Order of Judges. Also, Arcadia, at some point, was a republic. And although we know that republic doesn't always equal democracy, we might guess that at least the people had a sort of possibility to vote. Whereas in Rozarria, this is never mentioned. About Rozarria, let's talk about the invasion of Nabrodia in the beginning of the game. During the introduction, we hear that Lord Rosler is heartbroken because, quoting a character, Nabudis has fallen. Now, why did Nabudis fall exactly? And what is the role of Rozarria during these events? Nabudis is the capital of the Kingdom of Nabrodia, which is located closer to Arcadia than Rozarria, as we saw before. However, the Rozarrian Empire meant to stir trouble inside the Nabrodian population, and more precisely, Nabudis. There emerged a faction called the Neo-Rozarrian faction, which favors Rozarria against
the big neighbor
Arcadia, but maybe also against Nabrodia itself. And that, of course, could not be accepted by the Nabrodian authorities. So, at the time of the game's intro, there was a civil war between the people loyal to the Nabrodian king and the people from the Neo-Rozarrian faction who wanted to favor Rozarria regardless of the Nabrodian king because they thought Arcadia was coming, which eventually it did. And they only cared to have the strongest defense, meaning help from Rozarria. So we can say that if Rozarria's intent was to, at some point, invade the kingdom of Nabrodia, although it is located on Arcadia's continent, then it would have been a conquest from the inside. There rose a revolt amongst the Nabrodian population itself. However, as we know, the Arcadian Empire didn't really like this trouble on its continent, on its living space that we mentioned earlier, and as retaliation, not only did it lay a siege on the Nebrodian capital Nebudis, but it also used a weapon of mass destruction in this city. The Midlight Shard, which is its name, was first considered as a huge mystery. Some people even thought that it was the consequence of the civil war between Nebrodians, and not a result of Arcadia's intervention. Only Judge Sect will discover the truth himself in the Draco laboratories during the game, and, as we know, he was heavily involved in the event. But back to Rozarria. We should talk about the character of Al-Cid, right? Who is Al-Cid? He is from House Margrace. We do not know much more. We probably assume he is not the Rozarrian emperor, and he wasn't described or mentioned or referred to as the Rozarrian emperor's son, like Larsa is for Arcadia, for example. However, he must have a kind of eminent position to be able to talk to international figures, recognized or not. We can say that House Margrace in itself is not a warmonger. They prefer negotiating methods, not only Al-Cid, but House Margrace as a whole. Because Al-Cid in Bafenheim port doesn't say that he's trying to reason his family from House Margrace. He said that he's trying to only reason the generals, the Rozarrian military, which we talked about earlier. And that shows both that Rozarria's military is still very strong during the game, and that House Margrace in itself is not the one pushing for confrontation. They actually do not have their say because of the generals being too overwhelming and deciding everything, at least in terms of international relationships and defense. So Al-Cid, I'm not saying he wants peace because we don't know his full character, unfortunately, but he is definitely into talking and negotiating. And not only is he willing to negotiate with the unrecognized Princess Ash during the game from Dalmasca, but he also negotiates with the enemy, with Arcadia, and managed to form a sort of bond with the youngest son of the Arcadian emperor, Larsa Stolidor. I mean, Larsa is his bro, whether he wants it or not. And that is very interesting, because Al-Cid and Vayne are exactly the same age, 27 years old. I want to believe that's not a coincidence, because maybe, Vayne being who he is, Larsa, despite his support, at least initially for Vayne, might not find in him the fun he would like to find in an older brother. And maybe he finds that when he's with Al-Cid. So Al-Cid has this vibrant personality, also with his little birds who follow him everywhere and help him and inform him of what's going on. And Al-Cid likes to talk with everyone. That's what we can say about him, for the biggest part. Whether the enemy, at least on the paper, or miniskirt princesses from the nearby kingdom. He just likes everyone. More about Al-Cid from my cultures. I say cultures in plural because I'm referring to one very famous theater play in French language that is called Le Cid. And how would we say Le Cid in Arabic, which is my other native language? Al-Cid, mostly. So, what does Al-Cid mean in Arabic? It means the Sir, the Lord. So, who is it about? The real Cid, or Al-Cid, is named Rodrigo Diaz de Bibar, and was a Castilian mercenary from the 11th century. He fought for both Arabs and Spanish kings, but is mostly known for helping the Christian kingdoms gain territory against the Muslim presence. With those events being part of the historical period of 7 centuries called Reconquista in Spanish and Portuguese, and which consisted in conquering the whole Iberian Peninsula by the Christian Catholic kings, pushing the Arab and Muslims away. And that is why all the legends about him were mostly written by Christian countries like Spain or France. The play I'm talking about is very famous in France and was written in the 17th century. Now, why do I mention that? Because I love history, and you will find history references in this podcast whenever I can make them, but also because this Cid, or Al-Cid, was known for one thing: war feats. He was a good general, a good warrior. He made conquests in the Iberian Peninsula for various kings and conquered big cities like Valencia. While our Al-Cid, we just said that he's a pacifist mostly in the game. He tries his best to not start this war. Hell, even Larsa has a sword and helps the party and not him. He wants to convince the Rozarrian generals, who would be a bunch of Rodrigo Cids, to not fight against Arcadia because he knows it's not gonna end well. So I thought it funny and interesting to have a parallel between these two Cids, the historical one and Al-Cid from FF12. What can we conclude about the Empire of Rozarria in Final Fantasy XII? Back to the comparison, we can say that Rozarria and Arcadia, while having similar goals, couldn't be more different. And personally, I would really to find not only other Margraces, like Al-Cid, but also Rozarrian generals, because in the end, even if House Margrace came back to power in Rozarria, they still have a huge say in what's going on, if we talk about international decisions and war. Imagine, in addition to what we already have in the game, having to fight a Rozarrian general. Now that would have been awesome, right? Because Rozarrian generals are so crazy about going to war against Arcadia that they didn't cancel their plans even though they probably knew about the Nephysites. Does that mean they also had a similar power? If so, which one was it? We do not know. And thanks to Redis's memories, we also know that Rozarria, as a state, accepted to help Andor and Buzerba, meaning helping the Dalmascan resistance regain their country, just so they could get their beloved war against Arcadia. And you know another character who loves war between empires? Of course, his name is no other than Cid. And of course, I cannot end this podcast about Rozarria without saying how bad it is that we barely get to visit Ardalia, apart from part of Rozarria, which is the Yensa Sand-Seas. But on the other side of the Yensa Sand-Seas, in the middle of the Ardalian continent, we know that there are lots of landscapes with nature and plains. So it is a shame that we don't get to visit that. But we got what we got, and that was more than fun. Did you enjoy this podcast? Don't hesitate to tell me. Was it interesting?
That's what I wanted to hear. See you later.